So when you think about the sort of personal factors, there's just the idea that any kind of individual leader has their own particular values and beliefs and personality and their own intellectual capabilities. And all of these things can affect decision making. But then, aside from what's particular to any one individual, there are systematic ways that simply, as humans with human brains, we may not have the capability of making fully rational decisions. And your book, some of the things that they look at specifically, misperceptions.
Is that personal or systematic?
These are systematic, because the idea is the personal ones just vary from leader to leader. You know, the values that they bring to bear, their beliefs. Where these are the sorts of things that just affect people in the way that they think. So you've got, you know, sort of three categories that the book gives. When you deal with world politics, it's a little different than other political science courses like American government, because one of the things about world politics is you spend a lot of time looking at different theoretical approaches, realism, liberalism, constructivism, and I just thought that that book was better at laying those approaches out and making them clear. I also do use supplemental materials on Blackboard where I give them some articles to read and a lot of websites to visit, because, you know, when we're studying military force, I want them to go to the Center for Defense Information and learn about actual issues in military force around the world, or when we're dealing with political economy and issues of trade, going to the website of the World Trade Organization. So I also use those kinds of resources aside from the textbook. Well, in terms of constructing it, I mean, there's sort of this basic structure of trying to lay out these different approaches at the beginning of the course to say, you know, here in general is how realists see world politics. Here in general is how liberals see world politics. Here's how constructivists see it. And then dividing things up into the broad category of security studies and international political economy, which is the way in general that international relations as a field is broken up. And then kind of going through specific sets of issues, use of military force, sources of conflict. And I mean, just doing as an undergraduate course means, in a sense, kind of, it's a huge, huge field, you know, figuring out ways to limit it to some of the most important topics, because there's so many. It's, you know, it's the world, it's world politics, but what some of the key issues are: trade, the environment, all of those sort of specific areas, and then looking at them sort of from these different theoretical frameworks.
The recent President Bush went in, they said that it was leftover remnants because of what happened with his father in the previous thing, and that he was fulfilling what his father started and finishing it and stuff.
Right, and that could also sort of play into his personal biases and, you know, that whole issue of relationship with my father started something with Saddam Hussein and threatened to kill him, and now I'm going to come and finish the job. Or just the fact of when he met with Russian leader Putin for the first time, he came out and he said something like, I looked into his eyes and I could understand him. And he had this feeling of trust. And, I mean, you laugh, but I mean, it's interpersonal relations are going to matter. And if two leaders meet and they have positive feelings about each other, that might influence the rationality of their decision making, or if they have negative feelings. Well, at the beginning of the course, we do lay out, as I said, these different frameworks, and we start off with realism, which is the dominant approach. And realists tend to see governments as, they call it, unitary rational actors. And they say that you don't really have to look within a state. If you want to make predictions about how it's going to act, you only need to look at things that have to do with its capabilities and where is it in the world and what are its resources. You don't have to worry about things like, is it a dictatorship or a democracy, or what is the structure of government, or is there nationalist feeling? You don't have to look at any of that. And after the chapter on realism, we get to the chapter on liberal approaches, which breaks down some of those realist assumptions. And one of the things that they say is, well, actually in a lot of contexts, you do have to look within the state. It does make a difference. For instance, it's true that democracies don't fight other democracies. And so it's a clear example of a situation when the makeup of a state government matters. You can't just look at the international system as a whole. And then getting further into foreign policy making, within the focus on foreign policy decision making, just to say, well, you take the state as a rational actor, that's not going to get you that far. And so that's what we were working on today, was looking at some of those other approaches and saying, well, how do countries actually make decisions in terms of foreign policy? All of these rational limitations may or may not. I mean, they may not actually have an effect. And in some cases you can say, oh, well, Bush did this because, you know, his father didn't finish the war the first time or something like that. But there's also a lot of other reasons that, you know, if you're coming at this from a realist point of view, you can say, look, you can come back to questions of power and interest, and they explain these things just as well or better. Or you can come back to some of these models and you can talk about, you know, domestic political influence and the role of neoconservatives within his administration and the role they played, and you don't have to get into psychology. One thing that I want to say about teaching world politics at BMCC is that it is so great to teach this class here because of our students. A couple of years ago, I was at a roundtable at the International Studies Association talking about teaching and talking about issues of privilege in the classroom and getting beyond a US-centric point of view, which in a lot of world politics or international relations classes in the US, students come in and they just see the world as like America. America is right, and what's in America's interest, and it's typical at, you know, most major universities that pretty much everybody in the room spent their whole life in the United States. And here at BMCC, you know, on that panel, I was like, oh, that's just not an issue. We have other kinds of issues maybe, but every time I've taught this class at BMCC, there's always some international students or students who are immigrants and their families come from other places. I've always had veterans in the class who can talk about their military experience. And so teaching it at BMCC, it's just, in a sense, it's a lot richer than at other places because we get these different views about the world. And it does sometimes get heated because, you know, if you're from that part of the world and we're discussing it, or you've been in the military and we're talking about military actions, people come at it sometimes with very strong and very well-informed views. So let's say you have a choice. Well, it's actually my favorite course. I love it's, you know, the first course I ever started teaching, and I've taught it at different places in different contexts. And just for students, whether they're from the US or from other places, to start to see this aspect of politics, because in general, most students often see politics as something very distant from them, and especially something that's not US politics. You know, they can pay some attention to who's president and, you know, maybe writing your member of Congress a letter about something that's a legislative priority for you, but they often see foreign affairs as this very out there, distant, doesn't have an impact on me sort of thing. And being able to show them aspects of globalization and the interconnectedness of the world, and how when you have complaints about the economy, that, well, actually a lot of aspects of the economy are completely beyond the control of the US government, because they also have to do with things like China's decisions about how to value their currency. And that students, when they come out of the class, often pay attention to aspects of the world and to aspects of international affairs that just wasn't on their radar anymore. And they'll look at, you know, the New York Times online and maybe read the article like today on conflict between China and Japan, because it'll be more relevant to them, and they'll see a little bit more of what's at stake. Chris.
We're talking about this.
Hold on, let me make sure. Sean? Elizabeth? Elizabeth?